Some truths arrive not with thunder, but with the silence of an unscheduled stop. It begins on the iron veins of East Prussia. A train halts where no record says it should, and a woman vanishes without trace or name. What Holmes uncovers is not merely a disappearance, but a transaction cloaked in duty, grief, and the lingering debts of war. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The signal was never logged, but the trail, my friend, still gleams faintly beneath the dust. It was upon a damp and restless evening in late October that the case of the Moscow girl first entered our lives, though I confess I did not recognize its weight at the time. A chill mist clung to the windows of Baker Street, drawn inward by every draught, wrapping our modest quarters in a grey veil that seemed to mute even the strike of the lamplighter's rod below. Holmes, returned only that morning from Derbyshire, where he had been engaged in a matter involving a stolen chalice and a too clever vicar, had resumed his customary posture in the armchair beside the hearth. His long fingers steepled, his gaze buried deep within the coals. I had been making notes from a recent medical paper, when a muffled clatter of wheels and the stamping of hooves disturbed the usual rhythm of the street. Holmes, without lifting his eyes, remarked, "A visitor with purpose, and a Russian driver, unless I mistake the breed of that harness." Before I could answer, the bell rang below. When Mrs. Hudson admitted the caller, I was struck first by the man's height. He must have stood a full head above myself. And then by the angular austerity of his face. His cheeks were hollow, his temples sunken beneath dark hair brushed severely back, and there was something statuesque in his manner, as though he had been hewn from ice rather than born of flesh. He wore a long, slate-coloured coat fastened to the throat, and the buttons bore the unmistakable insignia of diplomatic service. In one gloved hand, he carried a hat still dripping with the London fog. He bowed stiffly. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "I am," said Holmes, motioning to the chair opposite without standing. "And you, sir, are not English?" "No, I am Count Pavel Orloff," came the reply, his accent restrained but unmistakable. "Formerly of the Imperial Embassy." "And currently?" Holmes asked with the slightest lift of his brow. Orloff's lips tightened. "Currently, a private man with a private concern." What followed was a narration, delivered with an icy precision that belied the turbulence beneath. Count Orloff spoke of a young woman, Katia, who had travelled alone aboard the International Express between Paris and Moscow. She had boarded with a second-class ticket, carried no luggage of note, and was reportedly seen speaking briefly to two gentlemen of diplomatic bearing during the Calais crossing. Then, somewhere beyond, "I am told she disembarked," he said, "but no witness can place her beyond the station at Gumbinnen. Her name does not appear on any manifest. Her papers are missing." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet, Count, you know her. Perhaps not her location, but her face." Orloff's jaw flexed almost imperceptibly. "Yes, I knew her. She was recommended to me for discreet passage. That is all." Holmes said nothing. I could feel a stillness form between them, a space neither of silence nor speech, but something colder. "I was never her guardian," Orloff continued, though the phrase came unbidden, without prompt. "There was no formal arrangement between us. I was merely asked by an old friend to assist her passage with certain papers. I have failed." His voice did not rise, but there was a suppressed urgency to it that did not escape me. The man's fingers, still gloved, clutched the cane he had not set aside. Holmes, for his part, remained unmoving, eyes half closed, chin resting lightly upon his knuckles. I knew that posture well. It meant he was listening not merely to the words, but to their rhythm, their inconsistencies, omissions, and evasion. "She was young then?" Holmes asked, softly. Orloff hesitated. "Younger than I. And Russian. She was born in Kazan, but she had lived many years in Geneva." Holmes's eyelids flickered. not in surprise, but in confirmation of some inner suspicion. "A curious combination," he murmured. "And her name?" Holmes inquired at last. "Katya," came the reply. Too swift to be calculated, yet followed by nothing further. "Katya," Holmes echoed. "A diminutive, not a surname. Surely we shall need more if we are to be of assistance." Orlov glanced at me for the first time, then back to Holmes. "There are certain political sensitivities. I trust your discretion extends beyond mere professional etiquette." Holmes smiled without warmth. "Discretion, Count, is the currency of my trade. But so too is truth. Without one, the other is counterfeit." To this, Orlov said nothing. But the silence that settled was weighted, deliberate. A silence not of omission but of protection. Holmes did not press further. After the Count had taken his leave, departing as he had come, in silence and fog, Holmes remained seated for some time, his gaze fixed not on the fire, but on the door through which Orlov had passed. "Did you note his gloves?" he asked me at length. "Of course. Black leather, of the continental style." "He wore only one," Holmes said. I started. "Surely not." His left hand was gloved, the right. The dominant hand, judging by the shape of the cane's wear, was bare, and showed recent abrasions at the knuckles, the sort not made by chance. I was silent. "Violence has a tendency to leave a trace," Holmes added, almost to himself. "Even among diplomats." That night, while the rain beat steadily against the panes and the lamplight curled like smoke across the wallpaper, Holmes lit his pipe and turned away from the hearth. "He lies, Watson," he said simply. "In what regard?" I asked. "In the regard that matters. The girl is not merely missing. She is either concealed or was meant to disappear. But why seek our help if he is complicit?" "Because he is not yet certain how the game ends," Holmes replied. "And neither, I fear, are we." The fire hissed softly in the grate, and the case, though still unspoken between us, had begun. I awoke the next morning to the metallic scratch of Holmes's pen and the rustling of telegraph paper. The air was still damp from the overnight rain, and the gas had not yet been lit. Holmes sat at the table, already dressed, a cup of untouched tea beside him, and 2 telegrams ready for dispatch. "One to Calais," he said, without turning, "to a chambermaid at the Continental Hotel, who once proved more observant than half the Sûreté. The other to Mr. Elphick at Victoria Station. You will recall him from the Blackgate forgery affair." "And what do you expect to find?" I asked. "Only a direction," he replied. "The girl's route is marked not by names, but by vanishing points." We took a hansom after breakfast. The air had sharpened, and the morning fog rolled in across the Thames, like smoke from a hidden fire. Holmes said little until we reached Charing Cross, where a rail official greeted him with a respectful nod. The real work, he had told me, would begin beneath the platforms, beneath the vast iron canopy of Charing Cross. Holmes located the steward with the precision of a man untroubled by uncertainty. The fellow, whose name I recall as Bissett, was a wiry creature with prematurely grey temples and an expression too seasoned for his years. He wore a worn uniform jacket. The sleeve. Bissett's face altered, not with recognition, but with caution. "There were many girls," he said. Holmes took a half step forward. "Not many who refused to remove their gloves in a heated cabin, nor who addressed a fellow passenger as Monsieur l'Ambassadeur in faultless Swiss French." The man's eyes narrowed. "Ah, yes, I remember her. Dark coat, no jewellery. Walked with her chin high but watched the doors as though she feared what was behind them. She travelled alone. To all appearances, yes. But not unobserved. I felt a cold weight settle between Holmes and me. Something unspoken had passed, though I could not name it. Holmes asked for the register, the handwritten log kept by stewards when serving refreshments. Bissett hesitated, then produced it from a battered satchel. Holmes scanned it with practiced speed. K. Desrosiers, he read aloud. Signed for tea, cabin 14. There was no Desrosiers on the final manifest, I said. Holmes nodded grimly. Because the name is false. She gave it quickly and without thought, likely chosen from a book she had once read. The mind under pressure recalls fiction more readily than fact. Bissett looked uneasy. She didn't strike me as French. She was not, said Holmes, closing the book. But she wished to pass as such, just long enough to avoid being catalogued. Did she tip you? Holmes added. Bissett nodded. With what currency? A Russian coin. Holmes gave the faintest smile. Not of amusement, but confirmation. I thought as much. Inquiries with the baggage office, accompanied by a discreet coin slipped to a clerk whose memory had otherwise failed him, yielded a curious discovery. 3 days earlier, a satchel had been recovered from under the bench of a second-class cabin on the Moscow Express. It bore no tag and had not been claimed. Holmes requested to see it, and the bag was brought. A modest leather case, battered at the edges and scuffed from travel. He examined the clasp, sniffed the lining, then turned it upside down onto the table. A slim volume, a silk handkerchief, and, caught in a tear at the bottom, a folded parcel wrapped in thick brown paper. Holmes unwrapped it slowly, revealing a sheaf of papers, water-stained and warped, and beneath it, a flattened diplomatic badge. The clerk leaned closer. They said it was rubbish, going to be burned. Then let us rescue it from such injustice, Holmes replied. He placed the badge upon a handkerchief and folded it. Second-class bench, he murmured, and yet the papers spoke of embassies. Holmes led us outside before unfolding the documents in full. The air was cleaner there, less tainted with coal dust and tobacco. We stood near the loading platform, the parcel shielded by Holmes's overcoat. The badge, once bright with gilt, had been scraped, intentionally, it seemed, to obscure the seal. What remained suggested the Russian imperial crest, though distorted. The papers, when laid flat, proved to be transit credentials. But they were clumsily forged, the ink too fresh, the script inconsistent, and the official stamps muddied by moisture. No professional hand, Holmes muttered. Likely prepared in haste, perhaps as cover, not as passage. He paused suddenly and raised the fabric to his nose. Do you detect it, Watson? I bent to sniff the paper. Perfume, I said, surprised, but faint. Jasmine, Holmes replied. A particular distillation used in Kazan salons. Not common, not exported. She carried it in her clothing, perhaps in a scarf. It lingered. He folded the badge again with care. Ink and jasmine, Watson. That is her trail. Inside the station's cramped record room, Holmes examined the official manifest of that week's Moscow Express. He ran his finger down the passenger ledger with precise speed, then again, slower this time. He stopped, frowned, and began again from the top. Not here, he said finally. Not under any alias I recognize, nor any spelling variation of Desrosiers. Could she have bribed her way on? I asked. Possible, but less likely. She was traveling under someone else's protection, or someone else's shadow. Holmes tapped the edge of the ledger. Observe the seating in second class. Row 14 is blank, no assigned ticket, and yet she signed for tea there. He stepped back from the desk, eyes distant. She was present, and yet invisible. Either her fare was paid outside the official system, or she boarded under escort. And if so, then the escort has more to answer for than delay. It was in one such document, nearly overlooked, that he paused. Amiens, he said quietly. Unscheduled stop. I leaned in. Engine stall? So it says. But no mechanic's mark, no repair noted. Only a brief halt, 7 minutes, in the dark hours of morning. Holmes folded the page with care. There are stalls that stall nothing, he said, and halts that do not appear on any timetable. He looked up at me then, eyes gleaming faintly. I believe our ghost left no footprints, but she may have stepped off at Amiens. The platform bell sounded, distant and thin. Holmes returned the file without another word, but the air around him had changed, drawn tighter, as though some knot had begun to pull at its own cord. When I returned to Baker Street that afternoon, my arms full with surgical texts borrowed from Cavendish Square, I found Holmes seated in a contemplative stillness unusual even by his own standard. The fire had burned low, the tea tray sat untouched, and in his hands lay a pale grey envelope, the kind used not for sentiment, but for silence. He looked up only briefly. "You are early, Watson." "Or the post is late. I have not yet determined which." I set down my parcel and turned my eye to the letter upon his knee. The paper was of heavy stock, its watermark faintly discernible, and the wax seal had been removed with meticulous care. There was no signature, no sender, only a brief and careful message, rendered in French so faultless as to suggest translation from thought, not pen. Holmes read it again aloud, slowly, as one might recite a confession. The young woman in question may have carried more than letters. The matter is not suitable for formal channels. If you are discreet, speak to Baronoff. He folded it once, precisely. It seems we are being watched, my dear fellow, and worse, expected. The letter bore no return address, yet the phrasing, its oblique turns and cultivated vagueness, was to Holmes unmistakably diplomatic. This was composed by someone well acquainted with the machinery of discretion, he remarked. A man who moves by influence, not authority. Baronov was the name given. Ivan Nikolaevich Baronov, a junior attaché recently arrived at the Russian embassy, known for his tact and forgettable presence. Holmes tapped the envelope with his forefinger. Observe the choice of phrase, entrusted with discretion, not information nor material. There is a moral weight to that language, as if the writer mourns even while concealing. I felt a subtle chill settle upon the room. "You believe the letter to be genuine?" I asked. "Undoubtedly, and deeply unofficial. A cry sent from behind the curtain by a hand that cannot afford to be seen moving." He stood. "We shall visit, Mr. Baronov tomorrow morning. But not, I think, as ourselves." Holmes's method of disguise was never theatrical. He eschewed the obvious tropes, false whiskers, ludicrous dialects, and instead altered only the smallest things: posture, diction, silence. By morning, he had become Mr. Henry Somerton of Sussex, a dry employer inquiring after a lost governess who had failed to return from Calais. I was to play the anxious brother, a solicitor's clerk unused to foreign embassies. "No grand invention, Watson," Holmes advised. "Just enough colour to pass unnoticed. Their instinct will be to underestimate you. Let them." As we reviewed our names and origin, Holmes added, "It is not deceit we practice, but accommodation. They have written to us without names. We reply in kind. That is the currency of diplomacy." I had seldom seen him so still before a meeting. Not tense, but calculating. The air about him felt sharpened. He sensed, I believe, that the embassy would give us no answers freely. The Russian embassy, set behind a high stone wall and wrought iron gate, rose from the grey London street like a relic transported from another age. Its facade, pale and narrow-eyed, gave nothing of its purpose or occupancy. Inside, however, the atmosphere changed perceptibly. The silence was cultivated, not merely the absence of noise, but the suppression of it. We were received by a footman with gloved hands and eyes that did not quite meet our own. Our names, offered with the soft hesitancy of deference, were taken down with care, and we were ushered through a marbled vestibule whose walls bore portraits in oil of uniformed men with too many medals and too few smiles. No voice greeted us there, only the measured tread of footsteps and the distant click of a door closing. "I dislike embassies," Holmes murmured. "They are like mirrors that do not reflect the truth, only the gaze of the one who looks." Baranov entered with the diffidence of a man raised in the shadows of higher offices. He was young, no more than 30, with fair hair too precisely parted, particularly in such personal matters. Holmes, as Mr. Somerton, explained the loss of a governess whose papers had gone astray on a return journey from the continent. Baranov listened with an expression of sympathetic abstraction, nodding at appropriate intervals, though never once asking for the woman's name. "Did she travel alone?" he asked. "We believe so," Holmes replied. Baranov nodded again. London can be overwhelming for those unaccustomed to our weather. It was all very civil, very gracious, and utterly devoid of meaning. Holmes offered a few further details, none real, but all plausible. Baranov's pen hovered, but he wrote nothing. "He listens," Holmes would later say, "like a man who knows precisely what he hopes not to hear." As Baranov turned to ring for tea, Holmes's attention drifted, subtly, without overt movement, toward the fireplace at the far end of the study. The fire burned low, unattended, and behind the small iron screen I saw what he saw, a ragged edge of blackened paper tucked behind the brass clock upon the mantel. Holmes did not rise, nor lean forward. He merely inhaled through his nostrils faintly. "Camphor," he said afterward. "Burned stationery laced with camphor oil, used to seal scented correspondence. Old Russian custom, one still practiced in Petersburg. One not employed for a missing governess. The scorch mark on the fire screen was fresh. A careless moment, or perhaps a last-second regret. Either way, something had been destroyed, recently, and in haste." Baranov returned with the tea, his face unchanged, his manner unshaken, but Holmes had seen all he needed. The embers had whispered what the man would not. As the tea cooled, and our conversation spiraled gently into irrelevance, Baranov rose with apologetic formality. "It is, of course," he said, "a terrible thing when the innocent are misplaced. But embassies," he added with a faint incline of the head, "do not interfere in domestic affairs, especially where no formal complaint has been made." Holmes offered a thin smile. "Quite so. And yet one might wonder, when a letter is sent without signature, is it truly domestic, or merely denied a home?" There was a pause. Something in Baranov's eyes tightened. Not fear nor offence, but calculation. A silent tabulation of what had been risked and what retained. "You are a man of insight, Mr. Somerton." "And you," Holmes replied, "of very careful omissions." They shook hands, briefly. Baranov's fingers were dry and cool. We had barely reached the cab before Holmes exhaled sharply and removed his gloves. "Did you see them?" he asked. "His eyes," I replied. "No, his hands." I shook my head. "The man writes with steel nibs. You can tell by the ink trapped beneath the cuticle, even after careful scrubbing. The pattern was recent, vertical strokes. A letter hastily drafted, Watson. Drafted, not dictated." "You believe he sent the note?" "I believe he wrote it, without instruction and at personal risk. His manner was too controlled to be careless, but his fingers betrayed him. The rain had begun again, soft, persistent. Holmes looked out upon the misting glass with a distant expression. A diplomat who burns a letter yet sends another. A contradiction, yes, but perhaps also a warning. It was well past midnight, and the only sound within our Baker Street sitting room was the gentle tick of the long case clock and the occasional hiss from the hearth. Holmes had not spoken for over an hour. He sat in the shadowed corner near the window, the dim candlelight making a silhouette of his profile as he tapped a finger idly against his chin. Then, without preamble, he stirred and stood. "She was being watched," he said. "Of that I am now certain. But the watchers are cautious. They wait to see whether anyone else comes looking." "And if someone does?" I asked. "Then they may feel compelled to intervene." I stared at him. "You intend to draw them out?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "There are actors in the theatre who can imitate a countess or a maid with equal conviction. One in particular owes me a favour from a certain incident involving forged marriage licenses and the Bishop of Durham." He crossed to the writing desk. "We shall need a fur coat, a ticket to Dover, and a set of eyes watching from the shadows." The next morning was crisp with autumn bite, and Victoria Station bustled with that peculiar blend of urgency and detachment unique to English travellers. I stood near the magazine kiosk, pretending to peruse the shipping news, though my eyes were fixed upon platform 4. The young woman who appeared was convincing scene. Her ticket bore a false name, her bag contained nothing but old papers and a French novel, and her only directive was to board, sit, and wait. Holmes had orchestrated it all with quiet exactitude. He himself, I knew, was already in position, likely having taken the adjacent stairwell to the western gate, where visibility was best and foot traffic least. It was then that I saw him, a solitary man, almost too still for the bustle around him. He wore a dark bowler, carried no satchel or valise, and bore the pale, pinched look of a man whose business was not pleasure, nor even work, but secrecy. Twice he stepped toward the platform, each time halting just short of the ticket inspector's glance. His eyes swept the departing carriages with clinical speed, returning always to the girl in the fur collar. Then, as the whistle sounded and the doors began to close, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd without so much as a backward glance. I craned to follow him, but had already lost his trail, until, moments later, I caught sight of Holmes, unmistakable even in his ordinary guise, gliding after the man at a distance of 15 yards. Holmes did not signal me. He did not need to. The decoy had worked. The presence of Katya had drawn a reaction. Not confrontation, but flight. And that, Holmes had predicted, was the greater revelation. Victoria Station, for all its iron grandeur, possesses a rabbit's warren of arcades and minor exits, and Holmes, by later account, followed the man through 2 of them. The stranger moved with apparent calm, yet his every motion revealed a singularity of purpose. He never looked behind, yet twice adjusted the cuff of his right sleeve, each time glancing toward the station clock as though awaiting a signal that never came. Holmes kept a measured pace, never closing the distance too far, never letting the footfalls echo too close. The man passed tobacconists, a watch repair shop, and a row of newspaper vendors, but paused at none. He cut through the arcade into the narrower alleys of Vauxhall Bridge Road, where the gaslights cast long stripes of yellow on the damp flagstones. Holmes later described the man's gait as one accustomed to English soil, but not to English suspicion. When at last the stranger turned down a narrow lane, Holmes slowed and took note of the door into which he vanished. Between a corsetiere's parlour and a pawnbroker's stall, stood a modest, unremarkable shop whose sign bore a faded legend. W. Marriott, Legal Forms and Stationery, established, 1856. The window was dim, with nothing but 2 ledgers and a sun-bleached envelope on display. It was not the sort of establishment to draw the idle or the curious. Yet it was precisely the sort to which messages might be sent, unrecorded, unbilled, and unremembered. Holmes observed the door for some minutes from the opposite side of the street, noting that while customers came and went infrequently, there was no bell, nor any clerk visible. He did not attempt to enter then. Instead, he circled round, made a note of the rear alley, and vanished into the fog. It was only hours later when I received his telegram, brief, precise, and unsigned, that I joined him there under cover of dusk. The ink, he would later tell me, was not on the sign, but in the air. When I arrived, Holmes stood just outside the narrow threshold, his hands folded behind his back. He inclined his head only slightly in greeting, and gestured that I should stand close. "Observe," he said, with that low restraint that always meant his mind was in motion. "No ink pots visible, no counters, no posted hours, and yet the shop is open." He stepped just inside. The air within was heavy, tinged with the sharpness of chemical solvent, and something metallic beneath it. The interior was sparse. A high desk, a ventilation shaft half disguised behind a bookcase, and in the rear a hand-operated press, its wheel freshly stained. "There's acid in the ink," Holmes murmured, "used for watermark emulation, and only by those who intend their work to pass inspection, however briefly." He pointed to the flue. "Ventilation is needed only when chemical agents are employed in volume. Someone has been printing documents here, quietly and with considerable care." And then he added, almost absently, the typeface was Cyrillic. Holmes learned from the owner, a mild man with hair like paper and fingers blackened from years of typesetting, that a parcel had been delivered some days earlier. It bore no name, only a phrase written in Russian script, "For the blue press, not the red." The man confessed he did not understand the meaning, only "head none." It was understood. Holmes thanked him, made a modest purchase of ink, and stepped into the street. "We have now seen the shadow of the message," he said to me, "and perhaps the shape of the hand that shaped it, but not the face." I asked him, "Then who sent the girl?" Holmes answered only this: "Someone who had no intention of speaking, only of being obeyed." The parcels office at Victoria, tucked behind the eastern platforms, bore little resemblance to the orderly bustle of the station's main concourse. Here, the air hung heavy with oilskin, damp rope, and the stale residue of wood shavings. Crates, marked for destinations I could not pronounce, were stacked in precarious towers, and a single flickering lamp gave the impression that all transactions occurred in the half-light of secrecy. Holmes approached the clerk with an envelope already sealed, not for posting, but for persuasion. The man, whose jacket bore the insignia of northbound freight, took it without expression and disappeared through a canvas curtain. Moments later he returned with a battered valise. "There was no tag," he said, "left unclaimed from the Moscow line 3 weeks ago. Second-class cabin, seat 14. We were waiting to send it to salvage." Holmes took the bag and bowed faintly. Let it never be said the Ministry of Lost Things lacked discretion. We left as silently as we had arrived. We examined the valise in a quiet corner of the station cafe, its battered leather creaking softly under Holmes's fingers. He opened it with the care of a surgeon, laying out the contents in a precise line across the wooden table. There was a silk scarf, worn but fragrant, as if imbued with lavender from long habit, a hand mirror of silvered glass, cracked delicately at the corner, and a single left glove, the kid leather finely stitched, and still bearing the faint outline of a feminine hand. But it was the final object Holmes lingered over. A small book, green leather-bound, tucked into the inner flap with almost deliberate concealment. "A psalter," I remarked, noting the gilded edges and faded ribbon. the sort given in boarding schools or by godmothers at confirmation. Indeed, Holmes murmured, turning it in his hands, but not one that has seen a chapel in recent years. He opened the volume, and I saw at once what he had already noticed. The margins bore notes. Not prayers, but patterns. Holmes placed the psalter under the light of our Baker Street lamp later that afternoon, brushing the pages with a fine sable brush to dislodge the dust of travel. I leaned over his shoulder as he turned each page, slow and unhurried. The notes were delicate, precise and penned in an elegant hand. At first glance, they might have been mistaken for pious annotation. The occasional underlined phrase, a word circled, initials in the margin. But as Holmes continued, the regularity of the placement became too exact to be devotional. "Observe the pattern," he said quietly. Not in the words, but the intervals. Each mark appeared in pairs, spaced by exact counts of verse. 10, 23, 42, always in even rhythm. "She has arranged it mathematically," Holmes said. "A liturgical rhythm would vary by sentiment. This follows no such impulse." I remarked on the refinement of the hand. Trained, possibly schooled in Geneva or Vienna. Certainly not peasant script. Holmes smiled. "No, Watson. This hand was not taught to pray. It was taught to obey." Within the hour, Holmes had retrieved from his cabinet a small brass cipher wheel, a curious relic gifted to him years prior by an admiral whose security had once depended on its turning. "This code is not of military origin," Holmes said, setting the psalter open upon the desk, "but it bears the imprint of diplomatic schooling. That curious blend of elegance and opacity peculiar to old embassies." He began to turn the wheel, aligning the psalm numbers to the letters beneath. What at first appeared meaningless, P37L4K, soon revealed a linguistic sleight of hand. The initials in the margins, when matched to the line numbers of the psalms they accompanied, yielded short phrases, abrupt, incomplete, and haunting in tone. "North arrives," Holmes read aloud. "Station beyond snowline. Await confirmation by fire." He looked up, eyes sharpened. "This is not a prayer book, Watson. It is a schedule." Each verse masked a message, each annotation a waypoint, and the psalter, once sacred, had become a map of coded intent. The next page revealed a longer phrase broken across verses. "The promise of fire shall accompany the exchange. Nyazapetrovsk, 19th, dusk." I repeated the name slowly. Nyazapetrovsk. Passenger stop. The perfect place to disappear, or to be handed over. He tapped the word fire with his index finger. Not literal, I suspect. A signal, a beacon perhaps, but the phrase promise of fire implies threat or consequence. She was to be exchanged, not met. My stomach turned faintly. "For what, Holmes?" He was silent for a time, eyes fixed on the coded message. Then, in a voice nearly grim, "Perhaps not for what, but for whom? Or for silence itself." I watched him then, not as a detective, but as a man. And I saw in his gaze something rarely granted to others. Not doubt, but distaste. "This is not a courier's path," he said. "It is a corridor, one with no return." Holmes turned back to the psalter with a sigh, rifling through the rear binding where a small flap had been sewn into the leather. He pressed a finger inside and withdrew a single slip of folded paper, brittle, its edges torn. We spread it carefully upon the desk. The note was in French, its script uneven, the ink smudged as though written in haste. "Si je n'arrive pas, sachez que. If I do not arrive, know that." But the rest was gone, torn clean through, and no second piece to be found. I felt a quiet weight settle over the room, as if the sentence itself had reached toward us and failed. "She intended to warn someone," I said. Holmes nodded. "Yes, but she was interrupted. Or worse, she knew the letter would not be permitted to arrive." He folded it gently and returned it to the flap. To whom it was meant, we may never know. But the voice, however silenced, speaks still. And again, I saw that rare expression upon him. Not calculation, but sorrow barely veiled. Holmes returned to the earlier phrase in the cipher, "exchange without consent," and repeated it slowly, as though tasting something metallic upon the tongue. "There is nothing bureaucratic about that term," he murmured. "It is not the language of protocol, but of cruelty." He stood and paced slowly before the hearth. The coals hissed in their grate. If it had been an ordinary transfer, a prisoner for a prisoner, the defector for intelligence, the message would have used the accepted terms. This is different. He turned toward me, and his eyes were darker than I had seen them for many months. She was not merely the courier. She was the cargo. And she either did not know, or knew far too well. A silence fell between us. Outside, the lamps along Baker Street flickered in the wind. She was to be given, Holmes said at last, in place of a confession, not with consent, but without it. That is the price empires pay for forgetting names. The morning was bleak and windless as we made our way down a quiet lane in Maida Vale, where fog clung to the hedges, and the street lamps still burned at midday. The man we sought lived modestly in a set of rooms above a bookseller's shop. A retreat, Holmes said, not from the world, but from its memory. Mr. Elias Grekov opened the door himself. Though his posture was stooped with age, there remained in his eyes a gleam of concentration not dulled by time. His hands, slender and angular, still bore the restlessness of a man used to managing a board in 3 dimensions. Holmes introduced us as researchers in need of expertise in non-mathematical structure. Grekov said nothing, only motioned for us to sit, and gestured toward the green leather psalter we now placed on the table. The room smelled faintly of old ink and varnished wood. No photographs adorned the mantel, only a single wooden rook resting atop a dusty playing board, as if waiting, still, for a move to be answered. Grekov opened the psalter with the delicacy of a priest uncovering a relic. He turned the pages silently, reading not the words but the white space, the margins, the numbers, the rhythm. When at last he spoke, it was in a low, precise voice. "This is not prayer. It is position." He traced his finger along the annotated verses, psalm numbers aligned by mathematical interval. Not a new method, but an elegant one. A pattern favoured by certain circles in Petrograd during the winter of 1888. The repetition here. It mimics the lines of a queen's gambit. Opening, decline, trap. I looked at Holmes, who nodded as if confirming an earlier suspicion. She was not transmitting, Grekov added, but staging. This is a layout, a message as movement. She was a piece in the game, and she moved. Holmes said nothing. But, Grekov continued, pieces do not move of their own will, not in war, not in diplomacy, not in chess. Grekov sat back, folding his long fingers. He did not look at us when he spoke next. There was no drama in the man's voice, only a sober finality born of long knowledge. She carried something, perhaps a signal, perhaps a falsehood, and someone above her, knew that to carry was not enough. She had to be seen, watched. And then lost Holmes met Grekov's gaze. To provoke a response. "Yes," said the old man, "a move in return. But if she succeeded, it means someone answered. Grekov slid the psalter back across the table. That is what frightens me. The answer, not the code. We returned to Baker Street in silence, the cab jolting softly over cobblestones, slick with morning drizzle. Holmes sat opposite me, fingers clasped beneath his chin, his eyes narrowed into the distance. When we entered our lodgings, he strode at once to the writing desk, cleared it of distraction, and laid the psalter open again. She was given a message, he said, legitimate, I believe, from a low-level courier chain, simple enough to pass, difficult enough to be trusted. But, I ventured, you suspect it was changed, not suspect, Watson. No. He drew out a second document, one of the forged diplomatic credentials retrieved earlier, and compared its dates to those embedded in the psalter's code. There is a shift. Subtle, but meaningful. The original cipher refers to a meeting in Odessa, but the altered message reroutes her to Nyazapetrovsk, a place of freight, not diplomacy. She was sent with one purpose, Holmes continued, but arrived with another. The message altered en route. The station changed. A triple game. I stared. So she was... what? Pawn, bait, or sacrifice? Holmes turned toward the fire. All three. Holmes moved to the hearth, where the flames danced in silence, casting long shadows across his features. In chess, he said softly, the removal of the queen before the middle game is not mere loss. It is imbalance. It invites desperation. He turned toward me, his tone now measured. Katya, if that is her name, was not merely a bearer of information. She was the visible queen. Her removal, staged or not, destabilized the field. It forced someone's hand. I struggled to keep pace with the cold logic of it. You mean, she was meant to disappear? Visibly? Purposefully? Yes, he said. To create panic, to trigger movement from those who preferred silence. He fell quiet. And if she was unaware? I asked. He paused, then spoke without inflection. Then she was the most useful piece of all. The words settled like dust between us. I had known Holmes to speak of nations and strategies, of agents and shadows, but rarely of people as persons. In that moment, I saw the faintest flicker of regret, and I felt it myself. Later that evening, Holmes revisited the cipher with renewed attention, laying out on the table a thin bundle of railway timetables and customs logs. Note the chronology, he murmured. She arrived in Paris on the 14th. The ciphered psalter references an expected departure on the 15th. Yet the records place her eastward departure not until the evening of the 16th. I looked up. A delay, Holmes tapped the corner of the log. Precisely 23 hours. Unaccounted for. No hotel booking. No embassy contact. No telegraphed confirmation. He opened the valise once more, retrieved the scarf and unfolded it fully. There, hidden in the lining, was a faint blot, ink perhaps, or something darker, and a tear sewn with clumsy haste. She was intercepted, Holmes said quietly, not at her destination, but en route. The message was not changed in London. It was altered in Paris. In that gap, he stood, back straight. Someone used her pause, her moment of stillness, to replace her signal, change her bearing, and mark her for disappearance. He turned toward me. Watson. It was not her movement that doomed her. It was her delay. It was not unusual for Holmes to receive curious envelopes from the continent, but the flat brown parcel that arrived by special delivery one fog-laced morning bore no return name, only the angular abbreviation KGR, stamped in violet wax. Holmes slit it open without ceremony and withdrew a rolled set of blue-grey schematics, brittle at the folds and marked with meticulous German annotations. A gift, he said simply, from an old acquaintance in Königsberg, who owes me a favour not easily forgotten. In railway matters, he is precise to the millimetre. He spread the diagrams across our breakfast table, brushing aside the teapot with one hand while flattening the curl of paper with the other. "This," he said, tapping a labelled section with the tip of his pencil, "is the lavatory compartment of the first-class carriage, identical to the one." To my untrained eye, it seemed ordinary. But Holmes had already found what he sought, a discrepancy hidden behind the mirror. Holmes drew the pencil down the cross-section with slow deliberation. "Observe the mounting of the mirror, listed here as independent of the wall frame, secured only at 3 points rather than 4. I leaned closer, frowning. "Unusual." "Decidedly," he replied. "For railway construction, any unsecured edge would invite damage during vibration. Unless, of course, it was never intended to be fixed." He tapped the page once more. "Behind it, see here, a narrow plate labelled Luftkanal, or air shaft. But look at the access panel, square, riveted. It is too symmetrical to serve a purely mechanical function." "You believe it conceals something?" "I do more than believe," he said. "I infer." He stood, already reaching for his gloves. The girl travelled in a space designed for concealment, but not by her. "The mirror, Watson, is not for reflection. It is for disappearance. Gaining entry to a foreign-owned carriage held in customs is no simple affair. But Holmes had anticipated the need. He produced from his pocket a folded letter stamped with a diplomatic crest, its ribbon still creased from hasty sealing. "I secured this through a channel," he said, "that I would rather not describe in writing, nor indeed aloud. Suffice it to say that the embassy in question prefers ambiguity to scandal, and has granted us access under the pretense of technical inspection." I examined the letter. Its language was artfully neutral, granting the bearer liberty to review structural elements relevant to passenger experience and international alignment protocols. No clearer deception had ever passed for official sanction. Holmes smiled faintly at my expression. "It is not deceit, Watson. It is diplomacy, seasoned, if necessary, with mischief." And with that, we set off for the storage yard in Deptford, where the Moscow carriage, now dormant, awaited disassembly under tarpaulin and rusting light. The carriage stood upon an isolated track, its windows streaked with soot, its livery dulled by rain. A station hand, bribed and indifferent, allowed us entry. The interior smelled faintly of damp upholstery and coal. We made our way to the first-class lavatory, Holmes carrying the diagrams under one arm and a small case of tools under the other. Inside, the mirror was just as the plans had shown, large, oval, with a narrow bevel that did not quite flush with the frame. Holmes ran his fingers along the edge, found the faintest resistance at the lower left, and pressed. There was a soft click. The mirror tilted forward by 1/2 inch. "Help me," he said quietly. Together we slid the panel outward, revealing a shallow recess lined with tin. Within it, folded upon itself, lay a handkerchief, white, crumpled, and stained at one corner with a dark brown blotch that needed no explanation. Holmes did not speak. He reached in, lifted it carefully, and examined the interior of the compartment. Upon its metal base was a smear, dried, flaked, and silent, and beside it, nothing. But what it had once held was plain to us both. We stepped back into the corridor, Holmes holding the handkerchief lightly by the edge. He laid it across the armrest of a nearby seat and turned it under the daylight from the narrow window. "There," I said, pointing. Near one corner, barely visible beneath the embroidery, were 2 initials, faint, almost erased, stitched in Cyrillic thread. O.V. My mouth formed the name before I could stop it. Orlov. But Holmes cut me short with a glance. Not severe, but cautioning. "No assumptions, Watson," he said. "Let the evidence speak." He folded the handkerchief precisely and placed it within a glassine envelope from his case. "There are many in Russia with those initials," he added, though his voice lacked conviction. But I knew him too well. His tone had shifted. Beneath the restraint, beneath the logic, something deeper stirred. a suspicion not yet spoken, but waiting to be. On our return to Baker Street, Holmes placed the envelope upon the mantel, as though it were an indictment sealed by higher courts. He did not speak for several minutes, but when at last he turned to me, his voice was clear. Count Orlov may have told us nothing false, but the omission, Watson, the omission may be greater than any fabrication. I nodded slowly. He knew she would not arrive. Or worse, Holmes said. He arranged that she should arrive, only to vanish. He moved to the window and stood there, watching the rain as it traced long fingers down the pane. He may not be her murderer, but he is something colder still. The architect of her placement. A man who builds the room where disappearance becomes function. There was nothing more to say. We stood in silence, the fog rising once more from the rooftops of London, like the breath of some invisible engine, pulling the truth farther into its depths. That night, I wrote in my journal, as I often did when the weight of our cases, satisfaction of a problem unknotted. This one was different. It was not shaped by revelation, but by unease. There had been something in Orlov's manner from the beginning, not untruthful, but impenetrable. I had trusted him. I had pitied him. Now I was no longer certain.
He may not have lied, but he did not tell.
And I felt, for the first time, that the man who had come to us with bowed head and diplomatic reserve might not be the mourner of the vanished girl, but her warden, perhaps not her killer, but something more terrible, her silent betrayer. I closed the journal softly, the ink still damp on the page. There are absences which speak more than presence, and I feared Count Orlov had mastered that language too well.
It was a grey afternoon when Holmes beckoned me from my reading chair with that peculiar light in his eyes, which always presaged motion. "Limehouse, Watson," he said. "A certain Mr. Taggart awaits our inquiry." I had long since ceased to question the apparent eccentricity of Holmes's destinations. Limehouse, with its winding alleys and curious aromas, concealed a multitude of trades, not all of them sanctioned. Our cab discharged us before a narrow shopfront bearing the faded sign, "Photographic Restoration and International Ephemera," its letters half effaced by soot and the river air. Within, we were met by a sallow man of indeterminate age, who greeted Holmes with the wary deference of one accustomed to bending rules for coin and confidence alike. Holmes murmured a name, not his own, and made a peculiar gesture with his gloved hand. "I believe a certain summer catalogue from the Petersburg consulate may have been misfiled," Holmes said. Mr. Taggart gave a thin smile. "Things often are, when asked nicely enough." He disappeared into the back, and the scent of silver nitrate lingered long after.
We waited in a silence, punctuated only by the distant clatter of dockside chains and the occasional drip from the ceiling above. When Taggart returned, it was with a leather-bound album which he laid upon the glass counter as reverently as a prayer book. Holmes, with gloved fingers, turned the pages slowly, pausing at a sepia-tinted daguerreotype affixed behind warped glass. The image was poorly preserved, yet haunting in its clarity. It bore the simple label, V. Summer Garden, 1880. The scene depicted a tree-lined path, bordered by iron benches and a stone urn. But it was the central figure, a young woman in light attire, her expression poised yet unreadable, that drew my breath. "Katya," I said aloud, before I could contain myself. Holmes nodded, but his gaze was fixed more on the shadows behind her, as though seeking what was missing rather than what was present. "There is always something behind the glass," he murmured, "if one knows where to look." The photograph, Holmes explained, had not originated in Petersburg, as I had assumed, but in Kazan, an older city with darker history. Through channels whose precise nature he declined to specify, he obtained a page from a municipal registry dated 1882, bearing the unmistakable likeness of the same young woman. Her name, it seemed, was not Katya at all. The record listed her as Olga Ilyinichna Volkova, born to a minor civil servant and educated in the seminary tradition. What struck Holmes most, however, was the notation appended in faded ink. Betrothed, 1877, to Lieutenant Mikhail Trofimov, 8th Regiment. Trofimov had been one of the early casualties at Plevna in the Turkish campaign, a brutal siege that left no survivors from his command. She bore the name of a ghost, Holmes said softly, folding the document. And once you wear such a name, Watson, it rarely lets go. I could scarcely follow Holmes's line of thought, but he pressed onward, revealing another page. This one, brittle and water-stained, taken from the archives of a now-defunct war tribunal. It concerned Colonel Victor Orlov, elder brother of Count Pavel Orlov, who had died under ambiguous circumstances during the same Balkan conflict. The report stated that Colonel Orlov had been given confidential orders of unclear origin, leading to the encirclement of his company and his death in a ravine near the Rhodope range. There had been whispers of betrayal, intelligence leaked, positions compromised. Yet no charges were ever brought. His widow had refused the military pension, and the file had been quietly closed. Holmes traced his finger across the red wax seal of the tribunal. It is always the unsent letter that condemns most loudly, he remarked, and always the living who rewrite the silence. I glanced at him, but his face offered no elaboration. Dared not inquire into. From him we procured a record of an uncategorized diplomatic cable transmitted from Kazan to the Russian legation in Paris mere days before Olga's disappearance. Its content was chilling in its economy. Request safe conduct for bearer. In memory of PT and OV, for the sake of honor, no reply was ever recorded. Holmes leaned against the fireplace as he studied the printout. She did not send it, he said. She carried it. That message, written in another's hand, may have been the last trace of a cause already dead. I felt the chill of those final words. And the names? PT, Trofimov presumably. OV, herself. He exhaled slowly. Not a plea for escape, Watson. A eulogy in motion. It was as though a tomb had been opened, and only the echo remained. Holmes's conclusions, when at last he allowed them voice, were spoken not in triumph, but in that rare tone of quiet compassion which he reserved for the truly broken threads of fate. She was not delivering a cipher, Watson, he said. She was escaping one. I stared at him, bewildered. She fled not from pursuers, but from history. From a past that had rewritten itself with such precision that even she could not say who had authored it. The girl we met was not a messenger. She was the message, or rather, the misprint. He turned toward the window, where the fog crept along Baker Street like a second thought. Olga Volkova bore not intelligence but guilt, inherited, misdirected, perhaps unearned. The fate of Colonel Orlov, the silence after Trofimov's death, the cable from Kazan, all of it suggested a trap designed not to capture, but to cleanse. And Orlov? I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He may have sought truth, he said at last, but he built his search on ashes. As we rode home that evening through the low mists of Marylebone, I found myself staring not at the gaslit streets, but at the small envelope still clutched in Holmes's gloved hand. The telegram unsent, or rather, unanswered. There is power in names, I said finally. They conceal, they reveal, they resurrect. Holmes nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. And ghosts, I added. Ghosts do not trouble me, he replied. But men who pretend they have none, those unsettle me more. We said little more until Baker Street loomed before us. And as I later penned my journal entry by candlelight, I could not help but ask, had Orlov truly sought justice, or merely a clever way to bury what could no longer be outrun? It was late in the afternoon when Holmes summoned me from my chair. with the same quiet authority that had, over the years, come to signify the arrival of some vital turning point. Spread upon the table were railway logs, brittle documents annotated in a hand that was unmistakably his own. "These are the eastbound schedules from Königsberg through Moava," he said without preamble. "I have traced the precise timings of Olga Volkova's supposed passage." He tapped one sheet. "Observe, here, just beyond Moava, a recorded reduction in velocity, precisely 2 minutes. The logs list no stop, no technical issue. And yet," he passed me a separate slip, unofficial in its formatting, where the same 2 minutes were noted by an engineer, along with the cryptic phrase, "Red lantern observed, no inquiry." "A ghost station?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "A ghost transaction," he murmured. "One that never made the itinerary, because it was never meant to exist. But someone, somewhere, ensured it did, for 2 minutes. Through an intermediary whose name Holmes did not share, we were granted audience with a retired signalman once stationed at the outer edge of Moava's jurisdiction, a man known as Staszewski, whose voice quivered less from age than from recollection. "I saw her," he said, eyes averted. "Lantern lifted twice, then down. 2 men with hats, no uniforms. They helped her step off the 4th carriage. She did not look afraid." "And did you report this?" I asked. He shook his head. "There was nothing to report. I was never on shift that night, at least not officially." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then merely asked, "And the lantern?" "It was red," said the man, "but it was not ours." That final phrase seemed to drain the remaining colour from his cheeks. Holmes left him with a wordless handshake. Outside, I asked, "Who were the men?" Holmes replied softly, "Not guards, not assassins, merely recipients." Holmes said little during the journey home, though his fingers worked unconsciously at the knot of his gloves. At last, as we reached Baker Street, he paused upon the threshold and looked back toward the east, as though memory itself stretched across the channel. "She was not killed, Watson," he said at last. "She was delivered." "To whom?" "To silence." I stood, dumbfounded. Think of her as one might think of a sealed envelope, addressed but undated. Olga Volkova was not eliminated. She was transferred. As one dispatches a debt, old, inconvenient, but not forgotten. And the 2 men? Agents of conclusion, not of punishment. She was never meant to vanish. She was meant to be filed away, out of reach. There was no triumph in his voice, only the cool solemnity of truth laid bare, a truth that neither vindicated nor condemned, but merely persisted, like fog curling through iron gates. The following evening, Holmes insisted we call once more upon Count Orlov, whom we found seated at his club, beneath a mounted boar's head and a shelf of unread Russian periodicals. He greeted us, not with courtesy, but with resignation, as though the meeting had been penciled into his fate long ago. Holmes did not sit. He stood across from the man and laid out his findings with the clarity of a prosecutor, but none of the cruelty. The logs, the unscheduled stop, the photograph, the tribunal note, the signalman's lantern, the telegram never replied to. Count Orlov listened in complete silence, fingers interlaced before him, eyes trained not upon Holmes, but on a blank space upon the wall, a space where once, perhaps, a portrait had hung. When Holmes finished, the silence did not shift. "You have nothing to say?" I asked, unable to temper the indignation in my tone. Orlov's gaze flicked toward me, not hostile, not indifferent, but utterly, completely unreadable. "There is little to say," he replied, and turned his gaze once more to the wall. As we made to leave, Orlov rose at last and murmured something in Russian, a phrase too soft for me to capture in full. Holmes inclined his head slightly, as if in acknowledgement. "What did he say?" I asked, once we were out upon the rain-streaked street. Holmes did not answer immediately. He merely lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the wind. "It was not an admission," he said finally. Only an end. But what were the words? Holmes exhaled. Jidi, vtishini. And that means? He looked at me, his eyes dark beneath the glow of a passing carriage lamp. Wait in silence. The words chilled me, though I could not say why. They were not a threat, they bore no malice, and yet they rang with the weight of a verdict, one not spoken in court, but written deep within conscience. We walked on, and the only sound was the wet tapping of our steps. That night, I found Holmes standing at the window, his silhouette long against the thin curtain. The lamplight from Baker Street cast faint shadows, yet none touched the hardness of his features. She was meant to vanish, Watson, he said, but not into the grave. Into quietness I said nothing. Some victories, he continued, are not won by force or truth, but by patience in darkness, by those who wait long enough for the world to forget the question, so that no answer is ever needed. Do you believe she is still alive? I asked. Holmes did not turn. Alive, perhaps, but not free. Never that. He rested his hand on the window pane. The world has its uses for women like her. Uses that require no gravestone, no eulogy, only absence. I felt the weight of those words settle in my chest like a stone. And Orloff? Holmes's voice was a whisper. Men like Orloff never lose. They merely remain. I closed the journal some weeks later with a hand that lingered too long upon the last page. The affair, such as it was, had left no entry in any official log, nor had any charge been brought against the men who arranged the stop, the lantern, or the transfer. There was no death certificate, no body, no confession, not even a headline. And yet I could not forget it. Holmes, in his usual manner, had returned to his books and monographs, content to leave the case suspended in the strange limbo where some truths are permitted to rest, truths that, if spoken, would only echo into nothingness. We never spoke of it again, but I sometimes caught Holmes gazing into the fire with an expression not of loss, but of awareness, as though some part of him waited still, just as Orloff had said. Justice, I have come to learn, is not always a verdict. Sometimes it is simply the quiet knowledge that someone, somewhere, remembers. And though no report was filed, no ink dried upon an official seal, the case of Olga Volkova was not forgotten. Not by Holmes, but in calculation. They are neither born of rage nor greed, but of duty warped by despair. In such cases, justice is no gavel, no gallows. It is the preservation of memory and the quiet refusal to forget. I said nothing, for the weight of what had been uncovered and what had not still pressed heavily upon my chest. What do you believe Count Orloff feared more? The exposure of truth, or the return of a name he tried to bury? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows with Holmes, do like, subscribe, and share it with a fellow mystery lover. Until next time.